Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Making Sense of the World. I'm your host, Joel Rubin, and I'm excited to be here to talk about democracy and the future of American democracy and the role of democracy in the world around us. And that's what we do at Making Sense of the World. We talk about complex international issues, bring on the best minds in the planet to discuss them, and try to explain how what is happening around the world affects us here at home and how what we do here at home affects us abroad. It's that intersection that makes us all smarter and stronger. And so I'm thrilled to be hosting Making Sense of the World and to be sharing experts and ideas with you. I have a very special guest today, my dear friend John Katz, and we're going to talk about democracy in the state of the world and what we see overseas and what we see here domestically. John is one of the leading voices on understanding democracy in the United States. He's a fellow at Brookings Institution. He wrote the Democracy Playbook for Brookings of 2025 to help us understand where we are as a democratic culture and what we need to understand about the trajectory we're on. He runs the Anti-Corruption, Democracy, and Security Project at Brookings. He has been a leading author and writer with op-eds, organizing convenings, getting out there on TV and social media and explaining what democracy is like right now in 2025. But more importantly, from my perspective as well, is that John is a practitioner. He's not just a theoretician. He's been in the field. He's worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development, at the State Department, on Capitol Hill, with Congress, on the House side. And, his experience in particular on Europe and Eastern Europe, which is his regional expertise, really feeds into a lot of his understanding about democracy. And because he loves America, cares about our politics, he sees a lot of things happening that we need to be aware of and things that he's learned from his experience abroad. So this is how we make sense of the world. This is why we're doing this podcast, because sometimes the world we live in here, we don't realize we're not that unique, that we've seen these playbooks, these authoritarian moves, the kinds of democratic fraying and decay that has been felt around the world. And there are strategies and there are methods to dealing with it. And so John, he's one of Washington's leading experts in it. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation today. So John, thanks for being with us.
It is, it's great to be here. Great to see you and to talk about democracy and what's taking place in the U.S., but globally. And I think you made that great connection between what we've seen and what we've learned over many years. Not only myself and others, practitioners who worked on the ground in countries that have been transitioning democracies, to seeing what happens when we have what we would call an autocratic playbook put in place and backsliding, and what it means to people who are on the ground. So really thrilled to be here. It's an honor to speak with you and talk about these things that we're all thinking about today in the United States and also globally.
So, John, look, we've known each other for a couple of decades and have been on this sort of journey in Washington together and leaned into different issues. I mean, why democracy now? Why for you is this so important? Why are you putting all your time and effort at Brookings and throughout recent years at other institutions as well? Why have you put it on democracy?
Yeah, it's, having started off running campaigns to working out on these domestic issues on the congressional side to then working globally. I think the reason why many of us do this work is because we want countries to both function, good governance. We want to see responsibility, transparency, accountability, governance, but we want people to succeed, everyone. And so this is about fairness. It's about inclusion. It's about, equal justice under the law. And so for democracy practitioners, having worked in this, I have seen up close what happens when governments backslide and how it impacts citizens at local levels. And when democracy doesn't even build, you can see in spaces globally that are constantly in crisis, where there's a lack of human security, many people from water to food to health to education. There's just not the opportunity. But if you talk to to people in a village in Zambia, like I did last year, about what they want. They want jobs, they want opportunity for their children, and the common refrain is poor governance or corruption, things that hold people back. And the United States, we're some of the luckiest people in the world to be Americans, to live in a system that isn't perfect, but provides an opportunity for all of us to have a voice and to work together to, in terms of democracy, but also thinking about our prosperity. So for me, there can't be a more important time in the United States, given what's taking place in Washington, the backsliding we're seeing. And I think this conversation is really important because we're really at this edge of a backslide that is looking more like an autocracy than democracy. And I think it's worth something to talk about, but also to fight for.
But so what, right? Like just play it out here, right? Like, let's say, a year from now, elections are canceled, right? Let's just, our elections, we've had such gerrymandering, decade gerrymandering, that now basically we already know who's going to control the House, and let's say it's the Republicans, and that's that. So what? I mean, why does that really matter to our economic well-being? Why does that really matter to our safety and security in the streets? I mean, look, we have the National Guard in the streets of DC, right? So we're safe and secure, aren't we? I mean, why does it really matter?
Yeah. Elections are one thing. Obviously, democracies, having free, fair, transparent elections are critical to democracies, to ensuring that we have a representative democracy where we as citizens get to vote for the leaders that we want to do the right thing, to represent us and the people, and how they do that is critically important. So if you're in countries like we see around the world, when you don't have fair and free elections, it often brings governments into place that don't represent the people and typically aren't functioning in the way that they should to protect the interests of the people, security of the people. And I think what we're seeing right now is a real concern about how the midterm elections look in 2026, when you see the type of effort to gerrymander seats in Texas and elsewhere. And that's really not what we want to see have happen, whether it's a red state or a blue state. So that is not the only challenge in elections that we see today or have seen, whether it's foreign interference or the control manipulation of media in the United States, to an extent that you don't know what is real, what's transparent, how to look at accountability if the numbers don't mean anything anymore. For example, jobs reports, recently, and the president firing the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics Commissioner. This is really important. Americans make decisions based on information. They have to trust that information.
That's right.
In fact, for the president of the United States to turn around because he didn't like the job numbers, maybe because his policies aren't working, and trying to hide that information from the public and then putting the blame on the BLS commissioner, is something that's disconcerting. Because how are Americans going to make decisions about what they think is important, about how government is working for them? Government works for the people, not for themselves, not for their own.
So it sounds like you're talking about democracy is a lot more than just votes. It's a lot more than just elections. There's a whole sort of undergirding of a culture, a society, an accountability. I mean, your work at Brookings, you deal with anti-corruption. Why would anti-corruption be part of democracy? I mean, in America, democracy means one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, and we just vote and we get our electeds, and that's that, right? I mean, tell me a little bit more about when you think about conceptually about democracy. For Americans, people are watching this and they're trying to understand the sort of chaotic era we're living in. Like, what is it about people like you who are talking about democracy that they need to really understand, so they get the sort of the framework within which Trump, quite bluntly, is operating? What is it about democracy that is not just about an election, a vote total, and then somebody installed in office?
Yeah. Elections are certainly not the only component of a democracy. It's also about the governance piece of this too. When you're voting, you're putting your stamp on what you want this elected leader to do in that place. If you remove the ability to have an election, say we're not going to have an election, or we're gonna sort of create an election that ensures that we win. That means that you really can't make that choice. The choice is taken away from you. And I think we've seen this in countries globally too, where even when there is a victory, like we saw in Venezuela recently, where the opposition won the election, when you have governance then controlled, state capture of institutions, security apparatus. We're seeing in the United States this federalization of ICE, of the FBI, moving into cities, LA. This past
Right.
few days, it's been Washington, D.C.
National
It's
Guard.
disconcerting. So
Yeah.
democracy is also about sort of the holding accountable of the government for what you voted for, but also that it's participatory, meaning that citizens get to weigh in even beyond the elections, directly with members of Congress, with local officials, with the mayor of their city. So there's multiple ways that citizens are involved, groups are involved. So, but if you start to strip freedoms away, assembly, freedom of the press, things like we're seeing at universities being told you can't speak to these issues, or corruption popping up. We've seen so many examples of where people are concerned about the aggrandizement of the Trump and his family and others around him. It's problematic, because then democracy doesn't function. And when democracy doesn't function, that's when you have people not responding to floods, horrific floods, including FEMA, or planes, making certain that there's safety and security. Or if you're thinking about healthcare, and you're thinking about millions of Americans that are going to lose their healthcare, there's something fundamentally wrong about the president spending $1 billion to refurbish his plane that he received as a gift from Qatar, while also cutting off millions of
Really?
Americans from healthcare. Where's the fairness?
Right.
And why is it that you would have government is not above the law, and there's not equal justice under the law, and I
So,
think there's a certain amount of a
yeah.
fundamental unfairness people certainly see, and they haven't put their finger on it yet. But for those of us who are working in this space, we have seen this happen in Putin's Russia, or in Xi in China, or looking at Viktor Orban in Hungary. There's so many examples, and the impact is usually citizens at the local level, people losing
So,
jobs, healthcare, education, things that have a direct impact on their lives. They need to know that the inflation numbers are real, the job numbers are real, and that government stands for them, not against them.
so let me ask this, and it's something that's always really vexed me with this sort of trajectory that we're on now over the past decade, really, where there's been this argument about the health of American democracy, certainly in the Washington environment, and I think in the media we've seen it quite a bit as well. If democracy, and if American democracy was back 2016, et cetera, if it was working properly for the American people, why would the American people vote for someone who ostensibly is tearing down our democratic institutions, right? Like, why are anti-democratic candidates so attractive right now in America?
Yeah, populism is certainly, these are populist messages too. I think it's because people, even within a system that functions, is still leaving out, or doesn't necessarily impact the lives of everyone that it should. And that means sort of at that local level, at state level, and then the federal has been dysfunctional, particularly at the federal level, for some time. Populism appeals. We can see governally in elections how, particularly after COVID and the COVID response, that sort of incumbent governments that were in place were voted out. And I think the there was a lot of turmoil, both economic, health, and people with very different degrees of approach to these issues. So a populist message can be very welcoming because it
Yeah.
purports to like say, I can solve all your issues, and trust in me to do it without much detail. And I think in this case, uh, a bit of a short memory about what took place in Trump 1, but
Yeah.
also, we're missing the mark too in how we are talking to each other at the local level, local communities. And I'm quite, I'm starting to see, and we're starting to see more of that grassroots response to what is happening now in states across the country, those groups that we work with and speak to about these issues, and sort of working our way through and back with the American public to understand what's taking place. A couple things don't help. One is disinformation and misinformation in media, how people are consuming information across the country, and the ability to discern what is real and what is not. And it's not that it's certainly the case. Hey, many Americans are smart across the board. It doesn't matter the political party, it doesn't matter the state. You're living in a local community, you're working, you have a family, you have things that you care about deeply. And I think it's a matter of thinking about fairness, justice, but at the local level, talking to communities in a way to look at what's being pulled back, how it impacts them, and sort of cutting through the chaff. So it's really hard to do it in this media environment. It's hard to do it with news deserts, across the country where people are consuming information. And it's also different generationally as well, as we're seeing through polling numbers. And
Yeah.
as we talk to different groups from the Gen Zs all the way to baby boomers now.
Do they care about democracy anymore, the Gen Z?
Absolutely. And I work
Okay.
directly with a number of Gen Zs who are doing amazing work at
Yep.
addressing the challenges posed today. But it's also a group that has been hard hit both by COVID, but also seeing conflict in government from Trump 1 to Biden to today, and sort of wondering, what does my future look like? How does, even if you're talking about economics, inflation, or can I afford a house, or down the road, or a family too. It really is a challenge to look ahead and see clearly, including with the current murkiness of tariffs, of information about jobs and jobs reports, to know whether or not you can trust government. And so that Gen Z is going to be an important part of the response, as is generate all these generations, because it has to be a Big Ten approach to responding to democratic
So,
decline.
so when you go and you talk to folks around the world every day, and in Europe in particular, which is a lot of your foundational work in policy, when you talk to them and they are looking at you as an American, an expert right there in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., at Brookings, as a fellow, as a leader on this issue, as someone who is every day talking to groups around the country who are grappling with good governance, democratic elections, local empowerment, issues related to information sharing that is reliable to help build a responsive government, as you just described, while it's under assault by our federal government and our federal leaders, while we have a Congress that is essentially a kangaroo, a rubber stamp Congress, and sort of a Duma. And then we have a kangaroo court in the Supreme Court. So we basically have our 2/3 of our branches of government cowed essentially by the executive, which really is autocratic, authoritarian in its structuring. When you talk to these colleagues around the world, what do they tell you? John, you better be focusing on XYZ. What is their advice to you that they want you to hear that you can then utilize to be effective here in the United States?
Yeah, and you sort of point to like there's a lot of lessons learned from our people that I've worked with and others in the democracy governance space, those that have worked in countries that are still under authoritarian rule, but have worked hard.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, lessons learned from them too is that when looking from a number of voices I've spoken to, is that what's happening in the United States compared to what happened in their countries. I'm talking about countries that have had sort of trappings of democracy and now have moved in the opposite direction, is that the speed of the breakdown of these key pillars of democracy is happening faster in the United States than it happened in the countries where they are from. So that's incredibly disturbing. But they also are, one of the things that is really unfortunate in the moment is that of course back in these periods they had and they were able to rely on the United States as a an ally in the fight for democracy and human rights,
Right, right. We
rule
were
of
always
law,
there.
combating corruption. You had the United States always having the back of of these groups. Wasn't always didn't always succeed in the sense that democracy couldn't always win the day or that there weren't human rights violations. And yes, even US policies sometimes went in the wrong direction. So it's not without fault. But a big, challenge, including, speaking to these organizations and groups around the world, this is around the world, not just in Europe, is
Yeah.
one is the loss of the United States as a leading voice for democracy and human rights. It is it's a US that is basically stands for nothing. What does it stand for? And it has lost its way in that space, and of course, that space is filled by others. Whether it's Putin's Russia or China or others, and they're very happy to see many around the world see and have said publicly, so happy the United States isn't there. I told you USAID was bad, or the United States was bad, and so the U.S. foreign policy, and there's ramifications, of course, of this for the United States in terms of our own interest, not only globally, but for the U.S. domestically.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of shock about this this complete change of the United States, almost bolstering autocrats. And of course, this week we have Trump meeting with Putin. And I would say, talking to
Yeah.
Ukrainians or others, look, they want the United States to be supportive. They even want President Trump to be supportive. They are doing everything they can to position themselves to say, hey, we want to work with the United States, a minerals deal that took place earlier this year. But I will tell you, underlying all that is a complete distrust in this Trump administration in terms of support. And so what you're hearing from Ukrainians or from others globally is an abandonment by the United States. And I think you see it in a strange way. It may not be apparent to those that are there, but there's been a number of countries like Cambodia and Pakistan that have nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's a
Genius.
lot of
Yeah.
there's a lot of talk. And I just want to say on sort of Nobel, like, that say, hey, this is a great man. And, I think it's a way for them to try to ingratiate themselves with Trump and the administration by showering him with praise. You don't see that coming from our European allies and partners of democracies, because they know one thing too, which is you don't win a Nobel Peace Prize by tearing down the democracy in your own country. That's an
Mhm.
instant no that you don't do. And also,
Yeah.
when you're abandoning democracy and human rights globally, it's really hard to be seen as a champion for peace, because peace requires that you put in place both security, economic security as well, physical and economic, and that peace means that you're not violating human rights. It means that Vladimir Putin doesn't get away with kidnapping 10,000 plus Ukrainian children and not giving them back. Or, and so I think we're in this place. But you asked me the question about, advice. And of
Yeah. What are
course,
they telling you?
there's
Yeah.
everything from that we're hearing from them. And that's something at USA we did, which was building civil society, making certain that there's an independent media to report on what's taking place, watchdogs, to look at what the administration is doing and the government is doing. And they would say this for any government: you should have in place these key components of democracy that are representing and making certain that how government is spending money, how the government is being represented is transparent, is accountable, that you know what's happening. But I think it's also the network building part of this that's really important, looking at countries that have had to claw their way back from autocracy to rebuild their democracies, where you have great advice from those globally. And I think one of the things that is becoming apparent is that global network for democracy without the U.S. there has been badly hurt. But it's also an opportunity for those
Yeah.
networks to rebuild. And I think share that information that you're talking about. And it's not just from democracies. We're talking about a circular support. There's plenty of evidence-based understanding of how this works in countries all over the globe. And those that have worked with the United States and engaged, who have plenty to share with us, and we need to be humble enough to learn from them.
So let me as we're bring us around the corner to the finish line here. Let me ask you the real kicker, and the thing that always comes in the back of my mind in these conversations, trying to make sense of the world and what it means, is what does this mean, sort of the trends you see in our democratic decay here domestically, the way the world sees us, our allies abroad, our democratic allies as nations being very concerned and not counting on us, to our partners around the world in civil society losing their North Star of the United States, which has guided them for generations. What does this mean for American national security? What does this mean for our safety and security in the world? How does this impact us as a country when we look to maintain our stability, when we look to maintain prevent terrorist strikes, when we look to prevent explosion of conflict? Just sort of laying out on a national security level what a democratic decay here at home means for Americans standing abroad.
Yeah, that one on the democratic decay at home means we're more vulnerable to transnational threats and challenges, right? So you've shifted all of your, in a non-transparent way, shifting money into programs. You're removing experts in the U.S. government that know how to protect the United States against global threats. And I'm talking everything from, pandemic, sort of transnational threats that we know, things that cross the border, health, right? And sort of disease, things that we need to guard against. And of course, when you remove the people that actually know how to respond to that, prevent it, detect, prevent, respond, that's going to leave us more vulnerable. When you remove the guardrails, the anti-corruption guardrails, that means that, that bad actors can park their money, in the United States in a way that they couldn't before. And that money goes back to these leaders. The United States has been one of the leading spaces for anti-corruption actions to park their money. So you're asking me, like, that makes us more vulnerable. Why are we helping or leaving ourselves vulnerable to our worst adversaries? Why are we allowing them to access our financial systems? That's problematic. And of course, bipartisan support in Congress has sort of said, hey, that's problematic. But the U.S. decline here at home, it runs in parallel to what we see globally. It's interesting, the U.S., what Trump has done at home parallels actions globally, from global health to anti-corruption efforts globally, to reducing backsliding democracy, sort of leaving that space open, to others. And it has a long-term impact, short and long-term impact on the U.S. economically, politically, leaves us more vulnerable to adversaries. And I think this has been a challenge to think through about how we can talk to the public about these things in the United States, because I think all Americans want, you could look at polling numbers. One, they do support democracy. They may have different perspectives, but they do support that. So you got to find that middle ground. They don't want the United States to be vulnerable. They don't want the economy to be unstable, for their futures as well. But globally abandoning these things is the loss of, several decades of U.S. soft power, destruction of alliances, or sort of near destruction. That's why we launched something called the Transatlantic Bridge Initiative. The new Transatlantic Bridge Initiative was to kind of think through how we're going to bring, even in a moment when you have governments that may not agree, we can agree together that these communities to keep working together across the Atlantic or across the Pacific to work with partners on the other side, because it's so important to do it. It's so hard, Joel. You're a former diplomat. I was as well, working at the State Department and USAID, working on the Hill. How hard it is to build alliances, how hard it is to build governance that works, and to tear it down in a 6-month period.
Yeah.
And then to not think, because Project 2025, which was it was their playbook. We may have had that. We may have, published the democracy playbook in January, but that Project 2025 playbook was a large part. It was about tearing things down without thinking about what you build or replace it with to ensure that the democracy remains, checks and balances remain, the things that Americans care about are in place. And so I know it seems to some people, hey, just tear it down. But when you do that, you lose so much, because all the things that matter in governance are hard to do. They're not easy. They're hard to do, and they're done by people who really care. And so, losing, 50,000+ civil servants and experts at the highest level, from national security to those who were handling my mother's Social Security, that has an impact. It has an impact across a ripple effect across the United States. And we're only 6+ months into this administration. And I think it's those gaps, the inability for this particular administration to be able to see around the corner, is what really worries me, is that the inability to see when systems fail and how they fail, and then who's impacted. I know the president wants to build.
It's going to be a lot of their voters.
Yeah, I mean, this impacts all Americans, red, blue, doesn't matter.
That's right.
But there's a difference between building a $200 million ballroom in the White House and making sure, the person in Iowa, who's at local community level that needs healthcare is getting the healthcare and support that they need. And so I think there's a disconnect, and it's really not populist to be more focused on building gilded ballrooms in the White House versus working with people in local communities impacted by disaster or their needs. And I think that's, and this is for Democrats and Republicans both, is looking into 2026 is to share that sort of, let's find that common ground, but also standing up for our values, what Americans, I think, care about: fairness, this equal justice under the law that clearly isn't taking place when you see what's happening in Washington, and you see a president who maybe believes he's above any type of accountability because he can pardon himself, believes he has immunity. But Americans don't have that in their lives. They don't have the ability. They don't have immunity, if they do something wrong. And they don't have the ability, every American, to go to Mar-a-Lago and give the Trump team a $1 million campaign and then have somebody pardoned by the president. It doesn't work like that. There's something, it's unfair. And I think that's where I think, if I'm predicting, I'm looking at my crystal ball, Americans will start to see that more clearly, that this is it's rigged. It's not a government that's doing it for the American people, doing this important work, but it's not certainly thinking about fairness. Americans can't do these things. And I think for Democrats, if the failure to understand how the public is thinking about this and the inability to communicate, if that's the case, and I think some Democrats get it, some may not, then they're likely to, if there's a free and fair election, Joel, you started off talking about elections in 2026, but if there's an election and if there's that disconnect with what people are feeling, and I think that was the reaction early on, was stand up for something. What are you standing up for? What do
Yeah.
what are you believing
Well,
in? So, and that's hard to, I'm a Monday morning quarterback. I'd like to see Republicans and Democrats speak the same language on these pillars of democracy that we wrote about earlier this year, protecting rule of law, protecting our elections, saying no to corruption. I think we should all agree corruption is not good for anybody at any level, local or state or federal level. It doesn't help citizens achieve the goals that they want for their families and communities.
well, this is great. I want to close with one tiny quick question to ask you. If there's one thing that everybody watching this podcast needs to do next to protect American democracy, what do you recommend they do?
Be active in their communities, meaning joining, sort of being aware of what's actually happening at that local level, engaging directly with groups. And it doesn't have to be with a local Republican or Democratic Party. It can be with groups that are working towards resolving some of the differences that we have in our communities. And I think in today, so much of the public is pulled away from each other to have difficult conversations about what we need to do. And I think if we're individual, we're separate, we're on our phones, we're a slave to the algorithms that have been put in place, and we're not going to have the conversations that we need to save our democracy. And I think every individual can play a role. They don't need to be a contributor in terms of funding, but if that's the direction that they want to go, that's great. But it's about being there within the community and working, Joel, something that you've done too at your local community. And that's where a lot of what gets done. People are having an honest conversation. And oftentimes, when we look at our polling numbers, even looking at local officials, they usually are held in higher esteem in terms of polling numbers. People think they're doing a better job than at the federal level because they can see the work. They can see the work of mayors, and they can touch them. They can hold them accountable and responsible. So if I could sort of wave my magic wand, and there's a lot of magic wands I want to wave in the system, but you said I could only talk about one. Is citizens. And I'm one too. You are as well. It's to be active at this moment. Don't be complacent because, I know people feel deeply about what's taking place on both sides of these issues in this political spectrum, but be willing to listen to the other side and also be willing to really think about these issues and think about what you want for your families and find that common ground.
John, it's brilliant. It's hard.
Yeah.
This is a very, very dynamic conversation. It's not going anywhere. So for everyone watching, listening, we all know it. This is the question of democracy is in our hands, as John said. And look, this is part of it. Doing this podcast, trying to make sense of the world, is part of creating a stronger democracy here for all of us. Sharing the ideas and knowing what's really taking place. And I think for everybody watching, you should definitely go to Brookings and download the 2025 Democracy Playbook. You can get it for free on the Brookings website, Brookings Institute. It's John's Bible. He wrote it with a bunch of top-notch colleagues. I'm sure you'll recognize some of those folks, but that is part of our ability, part of our playbook for how to make sure that we maintain the kind of strength as a country that got us to such a wonderful place where we Americans enjoy so much wealth and health and safety and security compared to, frankly, any beings in the history of mankind. I mean, it's incredible. We don't want to blow it. And our democracy is what really undergirded that. And so, John, thank you for what you do. Thank you for digging deep and helping us to understand what it means to have a strong, healthy, thriving democracy and what we need to do to keep it.
Well, great to talk to you, and I really appreciate it. I think this podcast is so needed, and happy that you're part of, and you're pulling these voices like myself into this conversation, and have an opportunity to talk about.
It's not academic, man. It's not academic. It's real. And that's why we're doing this, because this is real stuff. This is not just for the ivory tower, not just for the think tanks, but we got to make sure that the people, when they're thinking about what's taking place in our current moment, that they are hearing from experts. And by the way, I do want to put in a plug for expertise. I know I'm going long, but I'll say it. Expertise matters. Like, John sits in a think tank where people from around the world pour ideas into his inbox, and he helps to organize them, think about them, produce products for all the world to see for free. Expertise matters. And so by bringing experts here, what we're doing is we're actually opening up a window to the world for our audience through our guests. So I really value your expertise.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I would add to that we are talking to many organizations on the ground, grassroots, grass tops across the country. I think in a way that you said, this is not, there is bubble thinking sometimes. And I mean this when I said that it's a bit of humble pie, because the United States, American democracy has been such a key driver of America's success, meaning that, and much of which we're so lucky. I said this is the greatest country in the world, and we don't want to lose that. And when you lose it, and I'll leave this, what others around the globe said, is that the longer an autocracy remains rooted in place in leadership, the more difficult to impossible it is to reverse the changes that have taken place. What I'm saying is, don't take it for granted that what happened elsewhere can't happen here, and that may not be sort of the message that is reaching others right now, but it's really, that's why I said getting involved right now, not waiting. And then for those that are standing up for democracy across the country, and we've seen both on the left and right who have focused on this, it's so important that they're doing it now, right now. So I just want to add that because I think that the expertise that we're seeing, interestingly enough, and sort of these examples on the ground of success, whether it's sort of environmentalists working in Montana or Wyoming, are usually involved, groups from different political parties coming together. We need more of that right now. But the speed in which things are happening is I think one of the things that's most disturbing. So thank you for bringing me on to speak with you, Joel, as always, and so happy to chip in my thoughts.
For Making Sense of the World, John Katz, thank you very much. I'm Joel Rubin, and I'll see you next time.